Welcome everyone to this live episode of Afikra Conversations. Our special guest is Heba Gowayed, who is the Moorman-Simon Assistant Professor of Sociology at Boston University. Her research, which is global and comparative, examines how low-income people traverse social services, immigration laws, and their associated bureaucracies while grappling with gender and racial inequalities. Her forthcoming book, or her recently released book, Refuge, is an ethnography exploring the lives of Syrians seeking refuge in the US, Canada, and Germany. Heba, welcome to Afikra Conversations.
Thank you so much for having me, Mikey. It's great to be here.
So I want to talk about sociology. Let's start there for a second, because I feel like sociology is a discipline that is largely misunderstood. So when your students enter your class, what do they think a freshman who's taking intro to sociology class, what do they think sociology is, and what are they surprised that it actually is?
Oh, I don't know if I can speak on behalf of them. I think that would actually be an excellent pedagogical tool. I should definitely institute that, where I ask folks on the first day of class what they think sociology is. But I do agree with you that there is a huge misconception about what sociology is. It's not a discipline like economics or political science, even, that people feel like they know what it's about. So some people think, when I introduce myself as a sociologist, they think, oh, are you a social worker? Or I'll even get, are you a psychologist, which is more proximate. But sociology is really the study of people, of their interactions, of their relationships, of the ways that those relationships are stratified, of the inequalities that seem so persistent in our societies. And that's, the focus of my work as well, is on unpacking and thinking about those inequalities and sort of the myriad structures that shape them and that keep them so persistent, that make them so durable in the way that the world works. So things like race, like gender, like legal status, that animate and shape our social world.
Were you always interested in the relationship between individuals and their societies and individuals and their states? Was that something that sort of interested you as a high schooler and as a university student? And did it interest you in the context of the Middle East as much as the context of North America and Europe?
Yeah, so a little bit of personal biography. Like a lot of us who come from the region who end up in spaces like this one, my journey is complicated. So I was born in Cairo. I'm the daughter of a university professor. So I was raised in the United States as my father got his PhD and then eventually, became a faculty member. But he became a faculty member in Auburn, Alabama. So I grew up in the South of the United States. Nice. And and I'm in my 30s. So that means that for 9/11, I was about 13 years old. I was a freshman in in high school. And as the Twin Tower hits, we watched in PE class, the teacher, back then it was like the thing that, it rolls out.
You roll out the
monitor.
TV.
Yeah. You remember that?
TV, of course.
And usually that was a really fun thing because it meant that we were going to watch a movie or
you could hear it from down the hall.
Yeah. Schoolhouse Rocks or something was about to come on, or Bill Nye the Science Guy. But on this morning, of course, it was neither of those things. It was this super traumatic and super horrifying footage. And like everybody else, I felt really horrified. I felt really scared. I felt really disoriented. It's really hard to grapple and wrap your mind around what was happening. And just then, a couple minutes later, I heard my name on the intercom. And I went to the office to get checked out, and there was my father's friend was there. And he took his kids, took my brother into, he had a station wagon. We all piled into the station wagon. And on my way home, I was scared for my parents' well-being, right? Did my father, for instance, did he fly to New York? Did something happen? Did somebody get injured? Did a family member get injured? And when I got home, I sat around the kitchen table, and Baba explained to me that he took me out of school because Muslims were being implicated and Arabs were being implicated for 9/11. And he was worried it wasn't safe for me. And immediately I was angry with him because I said, why are you associating me with this? Like, this doesn't make any sense. Like, this had nothing to do with me. I was in PE class, just a couple minutes ago. And he explained that people make really bad decisions when they're fearful, right? People don't act rationally when they're afraid. And talked about the Japanese internment camps and talked about, various instantiations of this historically. And that moment was really a moment in which shifted my understanding of myself, of my environment, which brought race to the forefront of, my imagination. Though I had known about race before, but this really, helped me understand how the structures that surround us really shape our experiences and our perceptions and our, our realities of the world. And so that was a real shifting moment for me. Shortly after that, I read First They Killed My Father, which was about the Khmer Rouge. And I began to think about, this notion of fear and the ways that people, judge the humanity of others and deem some lives as more valuable, some lives as more important, some people as better than other people, just on the basis of, these notions that really have nothing to do with the individual people themselves.
You first start studying when you went to university. We're about the same age, so I had a similar experience in high school. When you got to, you went to school in the States, right? Mm-hmm. Afterwards. Yeah.
No, so undergrad I did in Cairo.
Oh, interesting.
Which is also part of that story, actually.
Yeah, so because I had the opposite. So I was in high school in the Arab world, and then I went to the States for university and arrived into Freedom Fry's George W. Bush post 9/11 America. What was your experience going backwards? I mean, not backwards, going the other direction, I should say.
Yeah, going the other direction. So it was really interesting. So my father was very much against it when I first sort of floated the idea of going to the American University in Cairo. And the reason was not that he thought it would be a subpar education or anything like that, but, we came to America for you to get, for you to have all the resources at your disposal and, for you to apply. So I was applying all around the country. There wasn't a sense that, I couldn't go anywhere that I wanted to go. But for me, I had the experience of 9/11, the experience of being, a young adult in the United States at that time, or not even a young adult, a child in the United States at that time, was really, in a sense, radicalizing, and not in the conventional sense of radicalization that we think of, but in the sense of, I really had a very strong urge to figure out, where is it that I belong? What is it? Who am I? Where do I fit? What is happening? How did something like this happen? How did the reaction? And when something like this, I don't just mean the terrorist attack, but I also mean all of the reaction to it that happened globally, right? The war, the discrimination, racism that happened domestically, the freedom fries, right? And so part of going to Cairo was very much, participating in, the politics of a country that I felt that I belonged in, but also finding that belonging, right? Because growing up as a 1.5 generation kid, you always sort of don't feel like you fit in. And the experience of going to Cairo was really important. And I really don't think I would have gotten to where I am now had I not made that choice. And I didn't fit in, Mikey.
Spoiler alert.
I didn't go. Spoiler alert, guys. There's you're kind of screwed if you find yourself in the position that I find myself in, because you're not going to fit in, right? There's going to be a sense of strangeness everywhere, and you have to sort of learn to reconcile that with yourself. But the experience really did give me a grounding of the Middle East wasn't something theoretical. It wasn't something that I visited in the summers. It wasn't my aunts and uncles, but it became a place that I got to know and got, on a day-to-day basis, right? It became my home. And after I graduated my undergrad, I stayed on to work in the Social Research Center of the American University in Cairo on a poverty alleviation program, which actually became my first foray into sociology. So I had majored in political science as an undergrad, coming with this political radicalism, and Middle East, political science specifically coming with this sort of radical perspective. But over the course of that, of those 4 years, I recognized that what I was actually interested in were these relationships of inequality that shape our political systems, but also shape so much more than that.
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the book. Let's fast forward a decade, and get to this book and sort of the conceit of the book. So it's called, for those who can't see the screen, it's called Refuge, and then the subtitle is How the State Shapes Human Potential. And that subtitle, I think, is the perfect description of what the book is about. Oftentimes you read subtitles and it's like it further
Thank
conceals
you so
what
much.
yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, further
That was
conceals
not
what the
an
book is about.
easy subtitle to come up with. I like fretted about it forever. So I really appreciate you affirming that choice.
No, it's really, really good. And so in a sentence or in a paragraph, what is this book about, and why did you actually decide to write it? And when did you decide to write it? Because
so I can answer the first part of that in a sentence in a paragraph, but I don't think all three questions
Go for it. Yeah, go for it.
will fit. But in a sentence, the book is about how people are recognized, whether or not people are recognized, and whether or not people get the resources they need when they arrive to a destination country to become the people who they want to be. And so we have this understanding that the skills and abilities that you arrive with in a destination country, whether you have the credentials, whether you have the university education, whether you worked a job that was lucrative, is what shapes how you do in a destination context. And what I show in this book, by looking at people who are pretty similar at the outset and arrive to three countries that have very different kinds of systems for recognition and investment, different kinds of welfare policies, is that you actually get three very different outcomes, even for people who have the same sort of skills and abilities when they arrive. And the case that I do is Syrians, right? So the book is also a narrative of the experience of Syrians who have sought refuge in these countries, their hopes and aspirations for themselves and their children, the complexities of who they are as people, and the ethnographic approach that I took really lends itself to that kind of exploration.
Yeah. Okay. So this is a very sort of 2011 to 2021 framed book. So my first question to you is, before we sort of get into the thick of things, is how much can you extrapolate conclusions that you sort of arrived upon in this book to other points in history and to other populations? Because it's interesting, when you did that one sentence, I don't think you mentioned the word Syrian until the very end. You're talking about people and countries and sort of destination countries more broadly. And I wonder, do you feel comfortable coming to broad conclusions or like indications, and how much does it actually apply to other situations?
Yeah, I think it applies not only to situations of refuge, not only to broader situations of migration, but also to any time people have had a disruption. So this idea actually came to me when I was teaching at a prison, Rahway State Penitentiary in New Jersey. The first time I thought about the idea of the state shaping human potential. And I had a series, there were 30 men in my classroom. And at the same time, I was teaching at Princeton, where I was a graduate student. And the men in this classroom who had been arrested and in prison, some of them on drug offenses, had the same potential, the same brilliance, the same abilities as people who were in my Princeton classroom. But of course, their possibilities were truncated because they were in these very different systems. And I wondered too, what would happen when these men left the prison, right? And had this disruption, had this disjuncture in their lives. And, would they be able to, as they exited, would they be able to have the resources? Would they be given the resources? Would they be recognized for what it is that they're able to do? And what does it look like for re-entry? So I think at any point where there's a disjuncture, we can think about recognition and investment as crucial mechanisms to shaping sort of what people do next.
Okay. So even this would apply to, because you're talking about not only related to war. So like, folks from New Orleans who fled during Katrina and ended up in Alabama and in Texas and Houston and Florida, similar experiences could sort of be observed.
100%. And, we can even think about it as over the racial lines within the United States. Mm-hmm. Diva Pager has a really one of the articles that I, and she passed unfortunately 2 years ago, but she has an article that is super central to my teaching, which is that she shows that for Black men without a criminal record and white men with a criminal record who are applying to the same job, and she does this by doing an audit study where she just changes the name on a CV, applying to the same job, that a white man with a criminal criminal record is more likely to get the job than a Black man without one, holding credentials constant. What this tells us is that the way we recognize people in general for what they're able to do, right, whether or not we value what they bring to us, really depends on whether or not we value them as people. And so this is sort of the central concept that I'm exploiting here to think about, what refuge means and what possibilities are open for people who are displaced.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about some of the methodology. So you focus on three countries. You focus on the US, Canada, and Germany. And so first, tell me why those three countries.
So my project begins in the United States. I don't initially intend to have any comparative countries. And as I got to know the families in New Haven, Connecticut, and as I became, more aware and more present in their day-to-day lives, I recognized how important the welfare system was to their story. So for people who arrive in the United States as refugees, as resettled refugees, which means that they're selected for vetting in countries of immediate refuge, which tend to be Jordan, Turkey, or Lebanon, as the chart that you showed earlier demonstrated. They're vetted, they're selected, and they're vetted based on their humanitarian need. But in the course of a transatlantic flight, they enter, their sort of designation shifts. And rather than being humanitarian subjects, they become sort of workers within the American economy. And in the United States, we offer very little by way of support for people who are workers. And so what happens is that these families arrive and receive TANF, which is Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, which is the nation's welfare system. And TANF has notoriously low amounts, is offered for short periods of time, and is geared primarily towards pushing people to enter the labor market. So what I observed is that, for Syrians who had arrived here, who had once been middle class entrepreneurs, who were carpenters, who were people who were artisans or who had middle class jobs and sometimes owned their own businesses, arrived here and were sort of integrated into American poverty, which is marked by stagnation. It's a quicksand that's really difficult to get out of. And I wondered what the experience of people in other countries would be like. So in Canada, for instance, where you have more expansive social service system, or in Germany, where you have a very different approach to social services, where the state is much more powerful, much more involved in people's lives. And so that was the basis of the comparison, was to think about these three countries, which also had taken in the highest number of refugees on the basis of resettlement and asylum, right? So not in general, the highest number of refugees taken is always in countries proximate to the country of departure, right? Is always in the global south. But in terms of who had taken refugees in the global north, the United States, Canada, and Germany led. So that also made them good examples to think about in terms of people's experiences.
So this idea of, state-structured human capital, which you talk about in the book, I feel like there's this, I feel like there's an illusion of altruism, right? And that the reason to take these types of individuals fleeing for whatever reason is because it's the good thing to do. But not because it's the smart thing to do to sort of make your state more competitive or more whatever, fill in the blanks. So I'm curious if that type of thinking, I'm not advocating for either one of them, but I'm curious if that type of thinking, as you unpack this idea, is prevalent among policymakers. Is that type of sort of calculus going into policymakers' calculations?
Yeah, so I think it really differs on the country. So I think in Germany, and a lot of people have said this, that in Germany, there's really a need for workers. And Syrians, in the world of people who are displaced, because their arrival to Germany was so close to when the war began, right? So people who are displaced tend to be in situations of protracted displacement for decades before they're resettled or before they actually receive refuge. In the case of the Syrians, that wasn't true because the war began in 2011 and folks were already arriving in 2014 and 2015. So you have laborers who have been in the workforce, right? Who have skills and abilities that are discernible or that are theoretically discernible to the Germans or to the Canadians or to the Americans. And so in Germany, the admission of about 500,000 folks, actually now Syrians make up, as far as I last read, about 1% of the German population, was, from a lot of commentators' perspectives, to bolster and to support the German economy, which had a very, very low unemployment rate once folks were arriving, had a very high need for that kind of labor, for the apprentice or semi-skilled labor. In the United States, of course, resettlement plays a very different role. And resettlement is sort of cast as an American tradition. It's cast as a symbol of American welcome. There's a refrain repeated over and over again that we are the country that offers the highest number of resettlement every year. And so in the United States, it's very much a political tool. And that was really its downfall, because during the Trump administration, it became a political target. So why would Donald Trump, there's so many different aspects of our immigration policy, but this became the focus. And the reason it became the focus is because it was the symbol of American welcome that he very much wanted to dismantle. And so, it's a very complicated story of why states admit refugees to begin with. And whether the goal is economic or not. And to some extent, we can't really speak to that empirically, right? We don't have the evidence to tell us one way or the other. But at the end of the day, I am less interested in that in the book. And I'm much more interested in, how do people feel? How are they received? Do they feel like they have a dignified welcome? Do they feel they're living decent, comfortable, dignified lives? Are they able to fulfill their sense of self? And that's where the idea of state-structured human capital came for me, is, are they given the tools? Are they given the recognition? Are they allowed sort of express themselves in their full possibilities?
Okay, so going into this, was that a question that you didn't feel like you had a hunch on, right? Didn't you go into this with a hunch of like, they don't feel welcome? They don't feel welcome? Or did anything surprise you as you were sort of writing the book? Like, oh, wow, I didn't think they felt welcome, but the color of their actual daily lives is different than I actually expected.
So I was surprised by a lot, because I didn't go in with a question. So I went in to be like, what are people's experiences? You have to remember, I did not plan to do this, or maybe I haven't said this yet. I did not plan to do this project. So I was doing research in Cairo. Yeah, I was doing research in Cairo. I was back. I was going to do, so the same project I was working on in the Social Research Center. I was planning on continuing that, which is the story of poverty alleviation policy and what it looks like for an Egyptian state, with funding from the World Bank, IMF, to do this national poverty alleviation program. And that's what I was going to do for my dissertation. And then, my access to my field site was rescinded. The political atmosphere around me sort of shrunk. I had friends who were in prison at the time, and I made the choice that I was going to leave and find another project. So I come to the United States. I'm super dejected. I'm laying on my couch when I hear on MSNBC that, Syrians are being resettled in the city that I happen to be in, which was New Haven. And that's how I began this project. So for me, there wasn't really a question when I began it. There was more of a sort of opportunity that I spoke Arabic. These people were arriving. And it was an opportunity to sort of learn what their experience would be. And so in that sense, a lot was surprising. Of course, in the other sense, I didn't think people would feel particularly welcome. But what I found, the mechanisms of recognition and investment, right? This idea that you need both would not have been clear to me had I just stuck with the case of the United States, and would not have been clear to me had I not done this project, right? So, so sometimes what we do as social scientists is we elaborate things we know in order to understand like how they work, right? And here, there were a series of things that came out of it. The mechanisms, what happens when we shift our focus from how people fit into countries versus how countries receive people, right? Which was my focus, was the latter, versus a lot of sociological work focuses on the former because it's a very, white discipline, and it emerges from a state focus. What is the benefit of bringing these immigrants here, right? Like questions like, what's the benefit of diversity? This trope of it has to benefit us. And so there was a lot that emerged that I would not have known to say, or I would not been able to say had I not done this project.
Okay, going back to my first question about what is misunderstood about sociology. If this book was written, if a political scientist wrote this book, how would the methodology have been totally different? How would the approach been totally different for somebody? Imagine you're speaking to a 13-year-old who's like, it's a book about refugees. In what way is it a book written by a sociologist and approached by a sociologist?
Yeah, so I think that, there are a lot of political scientists. I don't want to cast them with a broad brush either.
Yeah,
so
for
there
sure.
are a lot of political scientists who are qualitative and who are actually interested in a lot of the same things I'm interested in. But as a discipline, as a whole, political science is very interested in power and why people would act in the way that they are, why states are acting in a way to maximize their power, maximize their interests. Economists are very interested in sort of similar questions of interest maximization. And so for them, but also for a lot of sociologists, honestly, the focus would have been, and this is a big pushback that I get on this work, the focus would have been on outcomes. So, okay, so you told us the story of process, you told us how people feel, how people experience, but what does this actually mean for the country? What does this mean for returns? And you will find none of my work focusing on returns, because I don't think that the economic reduction of people into, a bottom line of how much they contribute versus how much they receive is a useful or helpful way to think about human beings, what we owe them and how they're valued and what their value is, right? And so even my approach to thinking about human capital, which is a concept that is taken from economics, used widely in political science, used widely also in sociology, is a rethinking and reimagining of that concept to say, okay, guys, you've thought about it as an attribute. You're actually wrong. It never works as an attribute. So then what is it? It's never something that's inherent to a person. It's always something that's socially determined based on whether people value that person, whether people value what they can do or not. And once you think about it that way, then you have to sort of step back and think about what this concept actually is. And what I come up with is the state structured human capital, which is really that all capital, all resources that we have, whether it be money, whether it be our skills, whether it be our social taste, is only relevant to how people are sort of perceiving it, right? And if people recognize it as having value.
Yeah, this is why the subtitle is so good, because the subtitle could have been Refuge, how human potential shapes the state, which would be outcomes based, right? And it's not. It's very focused on how the sort of directionality is different.
The other thing I want to say, actually, to your point, is that why doesn't say Syrians in the title or the subtitle at all is because there was a big pushback, and this is like from an Orientalism perspective, right? An advisor actually told me that I needed more Orientalism in this project, literally in an email. And what he meant, like honestly, like an actual email, so he wasn't really concerned about it. But
how was it not Appendix F in your book being like, all right, but
should have been. It should have been. Here's more, no, it should have been. But what he meant, and this was one of his major pushbacks against me, was like, you're not talking about terrorism. You're not talking about women's empowerment. You're not talking about domestic violence. You're not talking about any of the things that people want to read, according to him, when it comes to Arabs. And I'm like, yeah, because I don't actually think that these people are different from any other immigrant. He says, you're not talking about what makes them exceptional. And I'm like, A, not what makes them exceptional, but B, I think people are people. And when they enter the same structures, they kind of behave in the same ways. And he said, nobody would want to read that book. And I'm glad he was wrong, here. But this is a major part of it too, is that it's not an exceptional story of Syrians. It's a story of Syrians that is also a story of other people who are also going through the same structures.
Let me be sort of also simplistic. So what was the relationship of Syrians, these Syrians who unexceptionally, moved to the States and Canada and Germany? And let's contrast that to the experience of somebody like your dad, who came to the States. Just like the reason why these individuals moved to the States is different. But just tell me about the actual relationship to the state and how that actually differed for the experience, and how it actually shaped the difference in the human potential of these different people.
Yeah, I think about that a lot. And, I think a more striking case is not just these people, but also a Haitian man who I just met. So for my current project, so my new project I'm working on, project called The Cost of Borders, which is about sort of migrations and, people's experiences arriving to borders, what they spend and what they sacrifice to get to those borders, and how countries expend exorbitantly to repel them away from those borders. And thinking about the borders as this kind of transaction that's always costly and often also deadly. And I spoke to a Haitian man who was on the other side of the border, who has spent 6 years in Mexico because he wanted to reunify. He wanted to bring his 2 children from Haiti who are in a really insecure position to Mexico in order to cross with them. And I called Baba on the phone. My father and I are very close. And I called him on the phone and I said, I was talking to this man and I was thinking of the sacrifices that he had made for his children. And it made me think of you. It made me think of my father, who has made a lot of sacrifices for us. And, but my father came here on a visa. He was able to translate that visa to a green card. We were able to translate that green card to citizenship. We were able to have, exceptional upward mobility, right? Like, in terms of the American dream, right? I got my PhD from Princeton. My brother got his PhD from NYU. Everybody is very, economically comfortable and upwardly mobile. But those outcomes don't detract from the fact that this man in Tijuana currently, who's Haitian, is as good of a father, if not a better father, than my father, who I hold on the highest pedestal, right? And wants to work and speaks 3 languages even. I mean, even though you don't have to be skilled to be recognized as a human, speaks 3 languages. And it made me think about, and this is something that I get a pushback sometimes on Twitter, because I'll tweet about, bad American policies, and somebody will tweet back and say, well, your parents got here, your family got here, so how come, how could the policies be so bad? How could you speak from this position of privilege? But I believe that from this position of privilege is the exact place from which we should speak, because I don't think that I'm better or my father is better than that father in Tijuana. Yet the legal status that we're afforded is so different, because the American government or the American systems have recognized my father as having value to them that they don't see in this Haitian man, due to the color of his skin, due to the country he emerges from, due to the credentials that he holds. And I think that kind of valuation of human beings is really despicable and problematic, and also detrimental, when you recognize that this man, has so much untapped abilities and creativity and aspirations that he's unable to express, because the border sort of is a very, very low ceiling that prevents him from being able to ever be a part of this country and ever make the contributions that he's capable of making.
Yeah. I'm curious what sort of a response your book is going to have in the Arab world, because the borders in the Arab world are like the worst, right? They're awful. And I wonder how much do policymakers pay attention to this type of stuff in the Arab world as well? I mean, I'll put this into context. A couple of weeks ago, I was interviewing this Saudi hip hop DJ, Big Hass. Shout out to Big Hass. And he was talking about, we were showing one of his ciphers, video of one of his ciphers, and it's like all these MCs from all over the Arab world. Oh, it's the FemC cipher, right? And it was like all these amazing female MCs from all over the world. And he was saying, this is the potential of the Arab world. Look how beautiful it is. And I was like, yeah, it's absolutely beautiful. But what's awful and heartbreaking is that it's impossible for all these MCs to ever meet each other. Because one is in Gaza, one is in Berlin, one is in Sudan, one is in Saudi Arabia, one's in Yemen. That's like all the borders are closed, basically, So I'm curious what the response is from the region.
Yeah, I mean, it's yet to be seen for the second project, and I think a lot of the people that I did interview in Greece are, I did interview Palestinians, I interviewed Syrians. I didn't interview Yemenis, but I know that Yemenis are also there. I did interview Sudanese people. There were North Africans there. And the guy from Gaza told me about, one of the guys from Gaza told me about the difficulty of entering Egypt and the harassment and the violence that he experienced from the Egyptian officer, in the border crossing. And and, you know, how he brought his mother the second time he tried to cross in order to shield him, to protect him, you know, in an attempt to sort of use the sort of Arab filial piety norm to try to get across. And I think, you know, I think this story, the story of borders and the story of the violence of borders, and the reason why I really wanted to tell it, is a global story. And while I'm focusing on borders between the global north and global south, where the particular racialized violence that we see, for instance, in Greece, or on the border between Tijuana and San Diego, for instance, or on the US southern border in general, is most sort of flagrant or is most observable. Every story that I've been told has had, you know, these tales of bordering, you know, within the region as well, right? And particularly within the Middle East, because it's a region I know really well, that we can unpack it. But also, you know, in terms of even arriving from, say, you know, Nicaragua, right? People have really bad experiences in Nicaragua. People have had really bad experiences getting out of Brazil. And so I think there's a bigger story to be told about how these, you know, how border crossings in general, leading up to that final border crossing, right? How these journeys are sort of shaped also by domestic and by national, violences against, you know, even between people who might look very, very similar to the observer, to the external observer.
If you were to expand the scope of Refuge, unlimited sort of budget and time resources, if you were to expand the scope, what would be the sort of dream expansion? What questions were left unanswered for you?
Yeah. So people usually think that I would add more countries, but I wouldn't. I think that the Cost of Borders project, which is the project I'm working on now, is the expansion that I would like to do. And that's because I felt like the journeys to the destination countries were so unexplored and so meaningful to what these conclusions sort of meant to those journeys, and to what displacement means. But the other thing too is that I would really love to write a book, and at one point I hope I can, about all the other sites where this human capital disjuncture happens, right? Like how, re-entry from prison, for instance, is one that I think about often. Losing, as you said, your livelihood or things to flooding. Entering the workforce after you have taken time off, for instance, to take care of a loved one, which happens to a lot of women. What does it look like to think about this human capital in these different scenarios or in these different arenas, which is a different project from Refuge, but it's something that I do think about a lot.
Yeah. Basically like re-entering the workforce when state assistance is needed.
Mm-hmm. And when you've had sort of a rupture in your life, and that's kind of outside of your control. Yeah. And the other one is the financial crisis, 2008 financial crisis, something I thought about a lot.
Yeah. Also, I mean, COVID, right?
COVID is a great, I actually wrote a paper on thinking about human capital in terms of COVID for that reason. But that would be like a more theoretical project, but it's something 100% that I would love to pursue at some point.
Cool. Okay. So we're going to do some quick Q&A, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. The first one is, what are you reading or watching right now?
So I'm watching Hacks. Which is really good. It's on HBO. I like to watch frivolous things, so you won't get a deep answer with me there.
No judgment. Wait, what is Hacks? H-A-C-K-S?
Hacks. Yeah, it's about like these two comedians. I don't know. It's good. It's funny. Okay. And I'm watching and I'm reading, I always like to read a novel alongside my works. I'm reading The Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois by Honoré Fanon-Jeffers.
Okay, cool. What, I want to tag on to this. What book did you love as a kid?
Oh my God, there's so many. I was a big Roald Dahl fan as a kid. I don't know if that's like, yeah. So I really loved Matilda. I know that he's problematic character in my adulthood. But I was a really big fan of Matilda, which tells you a little bit about how I felt in my childhood, but
cool.
Maybe
it's
that's
hard
for another time.
It's hard to avoid problematic characters when you think about stuff like that. Okay, so who would you love to shadow for a day, past or present?
Okay, I thought a lot about this one because you sent this to me in advance. And one part of me wanted to be instrumental and political and like shadow a dictator to like reveal their secrets or something like that. But I actually who I would really want to shadow, and this is for my next project, so not the Cost of Borders, is I want to do like a food migrations book, which is about like how people like, you know, who don't have a name, right? Like who nameless people, you know, people who are like indigenous farm workers in the south of the United States, for instance, with Black people from Louisiana, they shared tamale recipes. So now there's like this thing, a Louisiana tamale, tacos were brought from Lebanese immigrants to Mexico, right? Like all of these. So I would want to shadow somebody who the history books have largely ignored to learn about these kinds of like food processes. So either an indigenous person in the south of the United States, or well, what became the United States, or for instance, a Lebanese immigrant, you know, at the turn of the century in Mexico.
Yeah. It's funny because I feel like that type of stuff is so unexciting in the moment, because like in the moment there, it's just like a matter of like habit, like, okay. Like I always
they're probably super boring. You'd have to watch them for like a month. You couldn't watch them for a day, honestly, because
it needs to be like time lapse.
Yeah.
Okay. What do people most misunderstand about your work?
I think that, you know, just to go back to what we talked about before, is this idea of like people wanting to focus on outcomes, right? People not understanding that it's really about the process. And also people, because I'm an Arab who studies Arabs, right? People trying to sort of pigeonhole or make it a story that's just about this specific group and not a broader story that has theoretical implications for other groups.
Yeah. I would imagine that people may think that you might fall victim to being like overly precious.
Like what, how so?
Like, as if like, you know, like you're like overly nostalgic about the culture of these people because you're sympathetic to their culture. And I would imagine, maybe I'm just sort of superimposing the thing that I feel like, applies to my life. I
think there's a me search element, and this is what they call it me search, where it's like, rather than actually studying something that like, you know, but I do think that we bring like being able to speak Arabic and also being able to understand the intricacies, and growing up in an Arab family and growing up, you know, with people from the region. I actually got to visit Syria in 2008. Means that I do have a stronger commitment to being honest and to telling the truth, I guess, like without using the tropes that Western literature affords us, right? Like the complexities of Arab families, the complexities of Arab men and women, the complexities of what it means to move, or what it means to migrate, or what it means to occupy any of these positions. But also to tell a story through them that's not exceptional. Right. So I actually think it works in the other way, but I do think that people think about it. Like, for instance, I get invited all the time to like Muslim groups, like Muslim, like run by white people. So like Muslim studies groups. And I'm like, I don't do that. I'm not religious. I'm not interested in it. I don't do that. But I get invited it's like clockwork. It's like, of course you want to be involved in the Muslim, you know, association, the Muslim study. I'm just like, I don't do religion at all. But people just like constantly just like assume, you know, Arab from the Middle East studying Arabs, then khalas, she must do religion, because that's what people think of as like the primary identifier as people from the region.
Yeah. This is why one of our core values is interest over identity.
I love that.
Whose work do you admire or are inspired by? Okay, so I want to preface this, because whenever I ask academics this problem, they have like a breakdown, because I have so many colleagues whose work. So many. Let's say outside of your profession, right? Outside of your profession, somebody who you're just like, oh my God, like Shel Silverstein, or like, oh my God, Maya Angelou, or oh my God, like Venus Williams.
Yeah, I am really inspired by novelists. I'm inspired by a lot of novelists. But recently I read Olga Dai's Dreaming by her first name is Sochi Mil, but I can't remember her last name right now. Okay. And I loved that what novelists are able to do, and what she does really well in that book, is she's able to like talk about the complexity, like the complexity of people, the complexity of political problems. And people don't have to be sort of villains or saviors. People don't have to be good or bad. People can just be like complex complicated. And I'm really inspired by that mode of thinking and that mode of approach to the social world, because I think people often are kind of complicated. And so I'm really inspired by novelists who are able to do that. And cool. Hers was a recent one. Honoré Fanon Jeffers also a book who does that. So there's just like a lot of novelists, particularly women of color novelists, who really inspire me in that regard.
Okay, awesome. So let's open up to questions. We have one question from the audience. We may have some more in the next few minutes. So this one is from Taima. She says, can you talk a little from a refugee perspective about the pressure of going above and beyond and working triple the amount just to secure a future, and their impact on the mental health of the youth and the way that employers and schools view them? An example, if the refugee isn't a quote unquote unicorn, then they are looked down on.
Yeah, this is something that comes up for all minoritized people, right? So one of my best friends in the world, her name is Sophie Solomon, and we talk a lot about like, why can't we just be like mediocre, right? All these, there's so many white people who are out in the world just being like absolutely mediocre, but the people who you see in the same positions as those people have to be exceptional, right? I grew up in a family very much where my father told me, you have to work twice as hard, right, to get half as much. And this is a phrase that's told to everyone, right? To every person who's minoritized, who's living in this country. But the case of refugees is particularly interesting here because it's not just working twice as hard to get half as much, but it's also that you have to be flawless. And not only you, everybody who's a refugee has to be flawless. So one of the things that really bothers me and that I really push back upon is the way that, even people on the political, center, right, the Democrats, will say that, well, refugees are the most vetted category of immigrant and no refugee has ever committed a terrorist attack, right? You hear this all the time. No refugee has ever committed a terrorist attack. And the problem with that argument is that it becomes, it lumps all refugees into one category. As though refugee is something like you're all part of the same family, you all control each other. There's like one mind for all the refugees, right? But like, so what, like if one person commits a terrorist attack, right? Like think about all the white people who've committed terrorist attacks, right? If one refugee commits a terrorist attack, does that mean that the basis for the refugee program is flawed? Does that mean that we need to vet people that much more, right? So this idea that in order to be a refugee, you have to be flawless, but also in order to be worthy of saving, you have to be someone who, has never, made a mistake, has never joined a political party that they shouldn't join. They even ask you about whether you've ever worked in sex work. There's all these aspects that sort of craft what it means to be somebody who's worthy of refuge and how that worthiness, and when you get here, you also need to express gratitude, right? There's this expectation that you're constantly expressing gratitude for being admitted, despite the fact that, as the book shows, right, receiving countries are not saviors, but are capable of incredible violence within the country by sort of denying people their possibilities and opportunities. And so, as we think about this, the expectation placed, so, and this is another thing that I do in the book, which is that I don't use the word refugee as a noun, unless I'm talking about legal status. So I'll say people seeking refuge, people in pursuit of refuge, people moving towards refuge, because it's really important to me that we center the people, and people, as I've said, are complex, not saints for the most part. And by centering the person, you allow for that complexity, right? But using the word refugees can be super reductive to a victim, to somebody who has to be worthy of saving.
Cool. We have another question from Lena. I'm doing a PhD on Arabic speaking refugee youth mental health in Berlin, and I'm curious to hear if you have any comment on the different institutional contexts of refugee youth across the 3 countries you have researched.
Yeah, so something that was actually really fascinating to me when I was doing this research is what happens. So I have a hunch, and we don't have the data to show this, but my hunch is that if you arrive in this country and you're about, 12 or 13, you have very different, arrive to the United States, Canada, or Germany, you're about 12 or 13, you have very different prospects for your future than if you arrive, say, at 16, 17. And that's because, particularly in the German case, you have to be a part of the German system in order to continue in the German system. So Germany has a very strong credentialization system, which means that, your admission to high school school really determines the rest of your life. It's actually pretty similar in a lot of the Arab world as well. So what that means is if you don't arrive at that crucial juncture where you can get the high school degree that then qualifies for you for university, you are not able to go to university. You have to, go through a different sort of educational track. And so what that means is that, for youth in Germany, if you're willing to play the game, if you're willing to go the educational track, maybe you're willing to go back a couple of years, you can enter this really narrow system and end up in a middle class job, right? End up in a job similar to other Germans because there's this like really, really narrow track. In the United States, your possibilities are more in the sense that if you arrive in this country and you do have the resources to go to university, we don't have as many obstacles in order to do that. But the obstacles, of course, are economic, right? So if you don't have the resources, if your family doesn't have the resources, and if you don't have the legal status, then you have no prospects for upward mobility, and you end up working a low-income job that's very, very difficult to work yourself out of. So these processes of recognition and investment, matter for the youth as well. I've seen very different outcomes. And the other thing too to think about is underlying all of this, and particularly important for youth, is mental health and mental health support. People have experienced incredible trauma. They've been displaced from their country. They've arrived to these countries. And if there isn't a very strong system, because as we know, mental health issues tend to emerge, in your late teen years into your early 20s, if there isn't a system to support folks who have had these traumatic experiences and who might be experiencing mental health, disjunctures, then that also impacts their ability to sort of participate in the system. So those are the two sort of reflections in that. Again, I mostly focused on older folks, on people who had established lives in their country in Syria. But this is sort of the reflections that I've had on youth experiences. Thank you for that question, and good luck on your PhD.
My last question to you before we wrap up is, how did the sort of survey respondents respond to you and respond to your intention of writing the book? And was that sort of response similar across all three countries and across all the participants?
Yeah, so it wasn't, so it's important to note that the way that I did this work was because it was qualitative, it wasn't a survey. And that's important to answer. I'm not being pedantic. That's important. That's important for the answer to your survey, because to your question, because the approach is very different, right? So if you approach somebody with a survey, you approach somebody with a document and you say, do you want to participate? Yes or no. For me, because they were longer durée conversations and they were longer durée interactions, consent became something that I was really fixated on. I wanted to make sure that folks knew what I was doing, particularly in New Haven. So in New Haven, I had a relationship with people I still have a relationship with them now, so this has been, a 7-year relationship now that we have. And so reminding folks about the book, reminding them that I continue to do it. And I asked them in the beginning, would you be willing to participate in this? And people said yes, but I was really anxious that they didn't actually know what I was doing. In Canada and in Germany, it was much simpler, because in Canada and Germany, I approached them as a researcher, first and foremost. I said, I'm doing this project. Will you do an interview with me? And I kept up with the Canadian respondents over time. But when we interacted, I was recording those meetings with their consent, and with their approval. And in Germany, it was even more, because a lot of these families have only met them or have only spoken to them for 2 or 3 hours of both of our lives. And so in Canada and Germany, that issue of consent was kind of clearer. Whereas in the United States, I really did a lot of work to try to remind people, hey, I'm writing this book, I'm doing this project, even sometimes recording things that I didn't actually intend to record, just to remind people that this is what the project that I was doing. And I think that they reacted to me because I'm Arab, because I'm Egyptian, because we share so much in common. But also because I'm a young woman, there was, the reaction to me was one of inclusion and welcome. But also, there was, the class difference, their feeling that they wanted to express to me what their class position was in Syria. There were these moments that, I was proximate enough where those moments were still salient, but I was distant enough where they felt like they could also share with me maybe things they wouldn't share with other people. So that positionality is really important. And I do write about it in the methods appendix of the book as well.
Cool. All right, last question from John. My name is John. I'm currently an undergrad student in Canada. Thank you so much for this talk. I was wondering, what do you wish students knew or studied more in relation to refugee issues?
Yeah, so something that I tell students in my classes, and thank you, John, for coming and for this question, is to be aware and think about when you hear in the media about, people talking about refugees, right? Be cognizant of what the kinds of characterizations or typifications of refugees are. So, for instance, anytime anybody uses a water metaphor, a flood, a trickle of people, a stream of people, right? That should raise a red flag for you, because people don't trickle, they don't stream, they don't flood, they move, right? So where's the human being in that? Any notion that the focus on security, right? The focus on vetting, the focus on the economic benefit of refugees. So refugees contribute X billion more than they, what happens when we frame people in terms of their economic returns on the country? So what I would encourage you to do, or what I encourage students to do, and what I encourage everybody to do, is just really be critical and put your critical thinking lens on when we see even the most liberal media's representation of refugees, and think about is this centering the human being, or is this creating a false sense that diminishes the human value, or diminishes the humanity of people who we're addressing.
Amazing. Thanks for all the questions. Heba, thank you so much for being a part of this. It was really a pleasure to be able to speak to you.
Thank you so much for having me, Mikey. This was great. And thank you everybody for coming and for your great questions.
Okay, everybody, this is actually the last conversation of this academic year. I'm excited to wrap up. So this will go up on the podcast and up on YouTube tomorrow. Share it with a friend, and we will see you next time. Bye, everybody.